Writers, if you've ever wondered how to navigate the ever changing world of writing and publishing, then you are in for a treat. Jane Friedman, who has spent nearly 25 years in the book publishing industry, is here today to talk about the second edition of her groundbreaking book, The Business of Being a Writer. Whether you're just starting out or you're already in the thick of your writing career, this edition is packed with insights and updates that will empower you to build a sustainable writing business without losing sight of your creative spirit. During today's conversation, we explore the most important part of the business of being a writer, the mindset writers need to cultivate to build a viable writing career. Grab your pen, open your heart, and get ready to learn the secrets to handling rejection, thinking not just about a book, but about your writing career and Jane's number one tool for creating sustainability over the long haul. Let's dive in. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, a podcast for writers who want to create stories that change lives, especially their own. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison. As a writer and trauma-informed writing coach, I'm here to guide you on a transformative journey through the art of writing, self-discovery, and resilience. Each week, I'll share my best tricks, tips, and strategies to help you write more authentically, craft deeper, truer stories, and overcome the common storytelling roadblocks we all face. Together, we'll explore how to bounce back when life gets tough and stay connected to your inner calling. So grab your pen, your notebook, and an open heart. It's time to do the work that changes the world, one story at a time. Well, hello, Jane. I am so excited to have you on the podcast today so we can talk about the latest edition of your book. This is the first edition, and I've been recommending it for years. So I'm so excited to both celebrate the fact that the new edition is coming out and to talk with you about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, how could I not? Especially knowing that this book is out. Seriously, I mean, it's an absolute joy. I always give my guests the chance to tell us a little about them first, just in case there are people out there who don't know who you are. And also, is there anything you would like us to know about this latest edition of The Business of Being a Writer?
I've spent about 25 years now in the writing and publishing industry. My whole work life, essentially, even going back into college. So this book is really the culmination of all those years. I'm a full-time entrepreneur, freelance writer. I don't work for a traditional publishing house or literary journal or university. I really value being fully independent, and so I think that gives me a lot of understanding and empathy for what other writers might be going through, especially if they don't have any institutional connections and they have to make a living. So I make my living as a writer fully. I know the challenge of that. And this book is, whether it's the first edition or the second edition, it's supposed to help writers understand the realities. I don't sugarcoat anything, but I'm also fairly optimistic that you can make this work. The business side of it does not have to be this distasteful thing that doesn't align with your vision, that doesn't work with your creative personality. I try to encourage in that book and in all of my work, frankly, that business issues are also creative issues.
Yes.
It's not about putting your nose in a spreadsheet for 3 hours a day.
Absolutely. And I think the more people can think about writing both as a creative art, but also as a business, especially if you want to publish for the public, I think the easier life gets because you begin to develop that vision around it. But some people are going to say, but, no. I want this to be my art. Don't say that B word. And yet I'm going to quote Amy Bernstein. She was at the San Francisco Writers Conference and she said, writers really need to see this as a business. Can you help us understand why we need to do that?
Well, it all comes down to what your goals are. If you don't have any goal beyond satisfying your own creative urge, if you don't have any goals aside from having this work for yourself, you can more or less cast off any concerns about the business or about the market. But as soon as you start thinking about, I would like readers for this work, I would like a publisher or an agent to invest in me or in this work, That's when you have to start thinking about it as not just your creative output, but what is the value to other people? What is it going to mean to other readers? And how do you position that? How do you present that? How do you
Yeah.
package it? I still think it's a creative act. I still don't think it's a distasteful thing. And coming away from this book, I hope readers see that just like producing your book or your art isn't a formula, the business isn't a formula either.
Right.
That's why it's so challenging. This is why writing is challenging. This is why the business is challenging. It's that there isn't a formula. But I think it's also empowering that you do not have to set this up in any particular way. There aren't any
Right.
rules that you have to follow. You can decide how this works.
Yeah. And I think figuring out what works for you is the most important thing you can do. And I just finished interviewing Amelia Ruby. She runs the Off the Grid podcast, which is all about how you can leave social media without losing your followers, your readers, or your business. And so she was talking about all of these different creative ways that you can connect with your audience so that you can continue to do this in a sustainable way. And I think that speaks to your point that you can do this through social media. You can do it off social media. You can do it in so many different ways. And the more you can find your own joy in the process, the more it's going to feed not just your business of being a writer, but also your creativity itself.
Absolutely.
When you're doing a second edition, what is the metric? Is it 10%? What's the percentage that has to be different? Because I think you took a different approach, but what's the percentage that has to be different?
This is one of those publishing industry things where there's no agreement or rule written in stone, but I would say it's going to be somewhere between 10 and 30%.
That is good to know because I had heard about 20%. For you to really have a legitimate second edition, it needs to have 20% more content, different content, changes in content. I believe I read in your introduction that there were times where you just changed entire paragraphs. I mean, there was a lot of rewriting that you did in this. And so if someone has the first edition, what's going to be new for them?
So for the second edition, there are a couple entirely new sections. One of them is devoted to platform. Wah, wah.
Yeah, I know.
It's the topic that's no one is entirely happy about it being front and center, but I try to show that this doesn't have to be a bad thing, once again.
Right.
I also open the book in a bit of a softer way with some mindset issues because the longer I'm in the business, the more that I recognize that a lot of long-term success comes down to mindset and how you're going to overcome consistent setbacks, rejection, feelings of failure or insignificance, you name it. Those things don't go away. Like, I'm 25 years in now, right? It doesn't go away. So you have to figure out your own solutions for being resilient through those setbacks. The book starts off very differently, so with the mindset and the platform. And then at the end of the book, there is a part on business mechanics that apply regardless of what industry you're in, with a little bit of a slant, of course, for writers and publishing. Things like, do you need an LLC? How would that benefit you? Tax considerations, legal issues, contracts, and so on.
Yeah. And I think when you were looking at how to write this, one of the things that you had to examine was what information in the first edition might be, I don't know if obsolete is the right word,
No,
but
that's the right word.
okay, we'll go with obsolete because so much changes in the industry. And how did you think about, okay, I've learned that some information is going to be obsolete. Obviously, you can't control for all of that because this industry changes so much. What lens did you bring to the second edition so that you could have the foresight to say, how can I create something that's going to have the greatest level of longevity for my audience so that if somebody picks this up 5 years from now, it's still going to have content that's relevant?
I really struggled with this because, especially if you go back to the first edition, you're going to find all sorts of social media references and discussion about the magazine media industry that really have zero relevance right now. And some of these things, there's always going to be a new edition of this book, perhaps for as long as I have a career. There are already sections of the book I wish I could go back and modify because of new services and new tools. I can't entirely future-proof it. That said, there's one big area I just put a big X through, and that's the magazine section, online media section, because it is a moving target. Unfortunately, I think the magazine industry is a dying one, or it's transforming so much that I don't think magazine is the right word to use for whatever opportunities exist. And there was a lot more, I would say, on like writing short literary journals, that ecosystem, which is also so in flux. And I feel like if you want guidance in some of these areas, you're much better off following things that are on Substack, for instance, people who are covering what it's like at this moment on the ground for those industries.
Absolutely, because things are changing. I follow a few different Facebook groups where people are offering updates. I also follow different people on Substack. And USA Today, for instance, they were accepting personal essays up until, I believe, a few weeks ago. So even places that are largely online now, what they're accepting, what their rules are, what all of that is changing so much because our world is changing so fast. And so I love that you were thinking about that. And I'm curious to know, the initial audience for the business of being a writer were people who are in MFA programs. Like they're in educational institutions, they are learning the craft of writing, and now you're teaching them the business of writing so that when they leave, they know how to create a viable career. And I'm curious to know, once the book was out in the world, was that still your primary audience? And as you think about this edition, I know that's a piece of your audience, but do you see that your audience is bigger or is different than what you anticipated?
I think it's still pretty true to my expectations when I first decided to do this book 10 years ago. I was very frustrated at hearing the same stories from writers, especially at the AWP conference. This is the big annual conference where people from the university community primarily gather, from MFAs and so on. I don't come from an MFA program myself. I come from the BFA program, which has a lot of the same issues at play. It tore me up to hear people on panels continually say, I wish someone had told me XYZ about the money, how much it would cost me to get this degree and how hard it would be to like pay off the debt, or how the industry was changing and I wouldn't be able to make money in such and such way, or how few teaching jobs there are, or any number of things. So I'm still always trying to reach more of those people all of the time. But I do think, even if you're not an MFA student, certainly a big part of my audience consists of people who are outside of those institutions.
Yes.
And it's obviously still helpful for those folks, regardless of where they're at in their career. If they're new to writing and publishing, I think this book is relevant.
Absolutely. And I have given it to many people who are not in MFA programs, though I have certainly given it to MFA graduates as well. It actually has been surprising to me, as a person who does not have an MFA, the number of MFA graduates who have come to me to learn about the business. I mean, obviously I'll say, well, Jane says, because you know more than I do, but it's been shocking to me that many of them didn't get anything on it. And then they leave with a thesis, but they're not even sure sometimes even how to take it from something that has a lot of beautiful language into something that is going to be more marketable to an audience. So I'm so glad that you've done this. And I love that you have shifted this to think about mindset first. And I also think it's great that you have the whole section on platform, because we all have to think about it regardless of what it looks like. But as you think about the mindset and your career, which spans 25 years, how has your mindset, or perhaps the way you approach the publishing industry, changed or not changed as your career has evolved?
Well, if I go way back to, when I was a student or in my first few years working at a traditional publishing house, I had this sort of idealistic vision, the sort of perspective that I think a lot of newcomers have, which is great work will eventually get noticed, or the cream rises to the top, which it took me, I would say, a good 5 to 10 years to realize that's bullshit. The cream does not necessarily rise to the top. Of course, it happens on occasion, but if you're sitting and waiting for that to happen, if you're waiting to be selected, if you're waiting to be noticed, if you put your agency into the hands of publishers or agents or whomever, I think you're going to be bitter, disappointed, and ultimately undiscovered. That's not to say there aren't exceptions to this. Of course there are. But I see a lot of writers just sitting back and taking a passive approach. And I empathize. I mean, I remember as a student feeling like, if I am good enough, if I demonstrate sufficient talent, then surely one of my professors will say to me, Jane, you were meant to be a writer. You should absolutely pursue this. Like that external validation that you're looking for, especially as a young person, you're hoping someone will say that. And you think that that's all you need and everything will be all right. What you don't recognize is that that fuel gets spent really quickly.
Yes, it does.
And you end up looking for more and more and more. And there is never enough. There is never enough to feed that. So you have to find your validation elsewhere, internally, whatever it is that motivates you to pursue this.
Yeah, it's making me think of this story that I recently read, and I wish I could place where it was, but it was a story of someone who was in a program and they were looking for that validation, and they had a meeting with their professor, and the professor said, I don't think you're cut out to be a writer. I think this isn't for you, and I think you should quit. And they graduated, and then they did quit. And then 10 years later, they came back to the same professor, and they said, how did you know that I wasn't a writer? Like, how did you know that I couldn't do this? And the response was the fact that you quit. Because if you really were a writer, if this really was your path, it wouldn't matter what I said. You would have continued to do it anyway.
It's a harsh truth. I think there's maybe even a Buddhist parable that's comparable, but with someone playing violin. The other thing that reminds me of that story is when I was in traditional publishing, I did a book with a guy named Bill O'Hanlon. He was a psychotherapist, so his book was really about mindset issues, and the title was Write is a Verb. It's probably still floating around out of print, used copies. And he talked about the 4 motivations that you might have that keep you going: blessed, blissed, pissed, and dissed. The reason I remember that is because I think at the time, again, with this idealistic vision I had, you shouldn't be motivated by anger or, some of the more negative emotions. But his book really opened me up to the fact that if there is that professor in your life or whomever, authority figure who says
Right.
you can't do this, it's actually a pretty healthy reaction to say, I'm going to show you and I'm going to do it anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that the whole goal is then to say, okay, well, how are you going to do it? If you're going to take this on, how do you do this? And that's where books like yours come into play, because it gives you some guidance as to some of the things that you need to think about. One of which is mindset. And I 100% agree with you that mindset is a huge piece of writing. I would say, as a writing coach, 50% of what I do is helping people with their mindset, maybe even 65. And then there is another portion that is the writing. And obviously the writing matters. If you're listening, of course it does. But if you don't have the right mindset, it can derail everything, because it affects your motivation, it affects your capacity for creativity, all of these things. So what are some things around mindset that you are inviting people to consider? And then I'm going to take it a little personal, if that's okay.
Sure. I would say one of the books that influenced me, I'll just go straight to the personal a little bit, that I quote in that book is The Art of Possibility by Benjamin and Rosamund Zander. Fascinating people, by the way. It's a great book to go read. I quote that book at least a couple times because I think often people will look at the frameworks that they're operating in, especially right now in the publishing industry. You hear a lot of negative messages about how hard it is. Agents won't take books unless they follow these certain rules, or you will never get published if X, Y, like so many people telling you it won't happen, it can't happen, or the industry is only interested in cookie cutter sorts of stories, or people with these certain types of platforms, or you have to be on TikTok. Like, I've been in the industry long enough now that I've heard all of these messages. I've heard them change. I've seen people chase the new metric or the new thing that you need to get published. And so the art of possibility is thinking about, well, these things exist. You're probably not going to get rid of them. I don't think you're going to become an activist and get rid of them. But what if you somehow change the framework of how you're approaching this? If you change the perspective, rather than seeing it as, I can't do this because, how do you say, if this is the way things are, I will do this in response? Like finding your positive way through that. I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about this at all. I am very much a realist, and I don't mean to suggest people go around deluded about how the industry works. But for example, you mentioned a colleague who is talking about how you can sustain a business without being on social media. How can you be a
Yeah.
successful writer without social media? And so obviously right now, I think we hear a lot of messages about how you must be doing X online to succeed. That is not in fact true. You can be very successful as a writer and be a published author without doing a lot of these things that are the so-called musts. Throughout the book, I'm trying to emphasize there are no requirements. There's only what is going to serve your existing or current goals. And you have to, of course, keep reevaluating that because your own goals shift, your career advances, the market moves. And then, so the other mindset issue, I think, just pertains to failure, rejection, which are always hard. I don't care who you are, it's going to be hard no matter what. And I don't think there's really a way through that other than finding the things that work for you to move through it. It's not about the fact that it happened. It's about what you do next and how you get to the other side or decide what steps will you take rather than shutting down.
Yeah. And I mean, rejection, it hurts everyone's heart. It just does. It's kind of the nature of the beast. But one thing that I see people doing that I think intensifies the hurt is they put all of their hopes into one thing and one outcome. And when that one outcome doesn't happen, it hurts more because there are no other possibilities. So I see that with people who think, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to go write this book and then I'm going to make $1 million or whatever. You know, it's going to quickly be picked up. Everyone has this dream. And man, what would life be like if it actually happened? Oh my goodness. But what I often tell people is having multiple things that you're working on can be helpful. And there's actually even a group on Facebook that celebrates rejections. And, you know, the whole reframe is, oh, you were rejected? How amazing that you showed up. And the more rejections you have, that's more proof that you are showing up, that you are pursuing your dream. And, you know, I was told early on, if you get to 100 rejections, your life is going to change. Not that, you know, you're suddenly going to make $1 million, but you will have learned enough that you're going to have more successes going forward. And that will not mean there's no rejections, but it's different. And when I first heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, no, that is too hard. I don't even want to hear it. And it was absolutely true. So I think you quote Ta-Nehisi Coates. He had an article where he talked about how part of the success is lasting longer than everyone else. Mm-hmm. And one part's going to be you're going to have learned more. And the other part is there are fewer people who have the same level of skills. And so, you know, thinking about that longevity, these different ways that we can reframe is so helpful.
Yeah, I think he talks in that passage I quote about how it's so easy to get kind of battered and beat up by the systems, which is, you know, 110% true. And there's this kind of unfortunate natural selection process that happens that weeds out the people who aren't willing to keep going or they're not willing to take the lumps. And this isn't about if you suffer enough, you will succeed. There are some people that don't reach success. There are a lot of different reasons for that, though. And sometimes it's because something you referenced earlier, people get stuck on a single project. I've seen people get stuck on a single project for more than 20 years. I see them coming back to the same conference with the same project. And it's like, there's a point at which that project isn't teaching you anything further, and it's time to move on to something else that you're interested in. Assuming you want a career as a writer, and I'm giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. I think you've got more than one book in you, or more than one project, or other things to say beyond that. Let's move on. You can always go back to that thing in the drawer if the time is right.
Yeah, considering the sunk cost fallacy around a project, whether or not it's going to be successful is really important. And also I think about what Ariel Curry said when I interviewed her, and she works for Sourcebooks, is that, you know, if you are a hungry writer, because that's the book that she was working on, you're going to keep working on your writing regardless of whether or not this book was successful. If it wasn't, write another. If that's not successful, write another. And sometimes it's the fourth book or the fifth book that's actually successful. I think one of the things I see on social media a lot that I have a problem with is immediate success. Someone actually sent this to me. It was how to write a best-selling book in a weekend, the 5 steps. And they said it very genuinely and very lovingly. I think you could learn something from this. And I was like, I think I have learned that this is a scam. And that, while there may have been a couple of outliers who probably had 1,000 things going on for them that go beyond your example, for most people, these quick fix, 5-step, this is how you become viral or successful, etc. I think they set writers up for failure.
Oh, absolutely. Another thing I've learned over my career is that there's no such thing as an overnight success.
Yeah.
Most so-called overnight successes have all sorts of things going on in the background that you don't know, you didn't pay attention to. A million different things are going on. This is also true of people with platforms where they may have a really significant platform that is working for them that's not apparent to you on social media or on their website or in the numbers, the quantified numbers. I think that's like the relationships and networks that people have can contribute to their success. And it leaves you wondering, if you don't know about them, how did that happen? And of course, part of my work is in trying to lift the curtain on all this and make it clear how success happens. And it's often in a million different ways, of course. It's not just one way, and it's not in a weekend.
No, it is never in a weekend. And there isn't a magic formula. And even when you have reached a certain level of success, there is no mountaintop. And even if you are, we'll say, closer to what some people might perceive as a mountaintop, you can still have setbacks. And so I'm curious, if we're getting real here, what's a setback that you faced in the last little bit that surprised you or made you go, oh yeah, I'm in the trenches too?
Well, just doing the second edition was a setback because I missed my deadline 2, if not 3 times. It was just a very challenging project. It was easier to write it the first time. But I don't know if that's necessarily a big setback, but I couldn't wait for it to be done. I think another setback I had was, this is much earlier in my career, when I thought I was going to teach full-time at university level, teach writing and do other like writing adjacent activities, publish books and so on. But I ended up taking a job at a literary journal at the University of Virginia. And, part of the reason I did it was just attraction to the status and the prestige of this publication. And for those who don't know, I'm based in Cincinnati. At that point, I had lived my whole adult life in Cincinnati. I'm from Indiana. I'm very Midwestern in nature and perspective. And so I wasn't really prepared for what I was walking into. From one perspective, it was a big mistake, a big career mistake. I was interested in the work, but I didn't really honestly evaluate the fit. And my gut was telling me that the fit wasn't great, but surely we could work through it. Well, spoiler alert, we did not work through it. I had to quit before I got fired. And so that's really what launched me on my current path, where I'm a full-time writer. I'm independent of any organization or business. I had to be shoved off the cliff, ultimately. I can't argue with where I'm at now. I wouldn't have it any other way, but it was a huge mistake at that time, given what I was thinking would happen as a result.
Oh, those times when we don't listen to our guts. I have had plenty of those in my life. And I'm always like, oh yeah, my gut was right. We all do that. And I think one thing that can happen when we don't listen to our guts is we can get into shame spirals or negative thinking. Right. And so there's just the negative perceptions that people can have about the publishing industry, or being combative from the beginning of like, oh, this industry is against me and I'm fighting against it. But then there are these things that happen just like they happen to you. How are you combating negative thoughts? When you think about that, or even just now, you have a setback or something happens, like what's your go-to to reframe?
I mean, the first thing I always do if things seem to be going off the rails or I'm not feeling very good about my work is actually to focus on the work. Almost every single time I'm feeling like there's a setback or something that's going on, it has to do with external factors.
Yeah.
So here's a really specific example related to this book and marketing and promoting this book. I mentioned the AWP conference, this big conference of writers and MFA people and all the rest of it. And this is a conference I've been going to for a very long time, very consistently for a while. My first year attending was 1998. And then when I went in 2012, I pitched 2 panels, got both panels accepted. There's still people today that actually come back to me and say, I still remember that panel. It was so interesting and impactful because it was looking at digital media and the transformation of literary culture because of digital media. Anyway, all of that is backstory to me proposing 2 panels for this year's AWP and getting both rejected. And I was like, this is supposed to be my big year at AWP where I come out with my second edition and they're not willing to put me on a panel. And I was, not that it was personal, it wasn't. And then I was on a panel proposal, I think, for a third one that also didn't get picked up. So I was thinking, okay, now what? Do I still go? It was certainly a low point. And I wrote a newsletter about this rejection to my audience. And I said, I fear I'm becoming a fossil. I've been in the industry for so long that you feel like, am I losing importance at this point? Am I just someone no one listens to anymore? But in any event, the good outcome or the reframe, let's say, is for those who don't know, you can pay AWP to put on your panel. You don't actually have to pay that much to get an entire stage to yourself for 75 minutes. So that's what I did. I paid AWP for my panel. I got my panelists, and we're going to do what I wanted to do anyway. And because I earn pretty good money, it's not like a hardship, and I think it's going to be worth every cent.
And it's going to be worth every cent and so much more to everyone who goes to that, because you are talking about one of the most important things that writers need to think about, which is where does your income come from and how much of it comes from your books?
Yeah, so spoiler alert, my book is about 1% of my income, which, for some people it might beg the question, why are you spending time on that book? But for many people in nonfiction anyway, the book is a business card. It helps bring people to you that might not ordinarily discover you. It's really important for the library market and for getting the message out to people who use libraries, and for a million other reasons.
And what I often tell people who are working on nonfiction books, and also true if you're working on a memoir or anything else, think about what are the doors you want to open. And sometimes the book is one of those mediums that allows you to open certain doors, which can lead to income.
Yes.
Well, as we wrap up, I often ask people, how do you nurture your resilience? And I get a lot of people who say things like, I walk in nature, which is amazing, everybody. I do it too. And I think it's an important piece of maintaining your health. But I'm curious to know, what's one way that you nurture your resilience that would surprise people or that people just wouldn't think about?
Well, you know that I don't walk in nature.
I do.
Some days I don't leave my house, and that's a good day. I think I have really strong boundaries about when my workday ends and begins. That might vary a little bit from week to week or month to month, or depending on what projects I've got on my plate. But generally speaking, when I leave my office at 5 or 6 p.m., I do not let work concerns enter my head again unless it's an emergency. So I don't have email on my phone. I don't look at social media on my phone because that's, for me, it's really all work related. I'm not reading work related publications, catching up on that sort of thing. Nada. And then in the morning when I get up, no phone, no social media, no email. I do reading that's really just for me, that has no career effects. And usually there's, some kind of like workout time, maybe like going to the gym with my husband. And then the workday starts after that. So I keep it really tightly confined. I think that for me, that's always been key, at least while I've been operating my own business.
And I think that's so important because when we are doing something that's a passion, it can be so easy for the passion to take over your life and then you actually have no life. That is something I am always trying to navigate myself. But having those strong boundaries allows you to recharge. And when you recharge and you slow your brain down, that actually makes you more efficient during the times when you are actually working. I mean, do you feel like that's the general experience of people, but is that your experience?
It is. It makes me much more effective when I'm at my desk. So, for people who've known me a while, it's probably obvious that work is my life. Like, that is my overriding passion. This is what defines so much of me. But I do still have the me that just needs to unwind and enjoy myself and not be thinking about my business or the business of writing and
Yes.
publishing.
Well, if people want to get a copy of The Business of Being a Writer, the second edition, or they want to connect with you if they don't know how, which I know many people will already know how, but how can they do this?
The best place is my website. It's janefriedman.com. That's where you're going to see the book, learn about my newsletters, classes, speaking. All of the stuff is on that site.
And if you miss that, it will also be in the show notes, along with a few things that you have done so that people can get a taste of your work, which I have to say is brilliant. I've been following you for years. I feel so grateful to know you in many different ways. And I'm super excited about this book because the more you know about how things work, the more resilient you're going to be as a writer because you can have your own agency and you can make choices for yourself based on what's best for you. And in that way, knowledge is power.
Exactly right. Thank you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise.
Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Jane and most importantly, buy a copy of the second edition of The Business of Being a Writer, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would leave a comment on YouTube or text the show if you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify with the answer to the following question. Which feeling state serves as your biggest motivator? Blessed, blissed, pissed, or dissed? I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that one. And speaking of your thoughts on the podcast, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Krista Hillhouse, Wendy Kanar, Jessica Brophy, and Joy V for your praise of my latest episode with Lily Danziger. I love how much this episode inspired you. Thank you for letting me know. And if you haven't contacted the show, I'd love to hear from you too. And until next time, remember that your story matters. And as you work on it, you change lives, especially your own. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe or follow Writing Your Resilience on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review to help others discover the podcast. 3, join my engaged writing community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, a toolkit for gaslight proofing your writing practice. Have feedback for the show, a topic you'd love me to cover, or questions you'd like me to answer? Drop a comment on YouTube, text the show, or email me at writingyourresiliencepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep writing, keep growing, and keep showing up for yourself. Your story matters, and I am so proud to be writing alongside you.